Jaron, I've been obsessed with consciousness my entire adult and even pre-adult life. Recently, I've talked to brain scientists, philosophers, theologians. Everybody has different opinion. But some would say that consciousness is an illusion. It's not real. We think it's real, but because of the biology, it really isn't. You've had such unusual views and appreciations for these different points. How do you look at consciousness?
Well, look, if consciousness is anything at all, then what it is exactly that one thing that isn't reduced at all if it's an illusion.
Okay, let's go a little bit slower on that one.
So, consciousness is hard to talk about because almost all the vocabulary that you might want to use has been colonized by people who think it doesn't exist. So you can think of consciousness as a program running inside a robot or a person that models something global about that organism. And that's a legitimate thing to study, and that kind of consciousness would seem to exist.
Right.
Now, this question of experience, of the experience of experience, this thing, which is actually hard to capture in language, I have found you either get that idea or you don't. And a great many people I respect simply don't get it. I mean, I talked to Dan Dennett, who I adore, and he just has no idea what the thing is that we're trying to talk about.
Well, I talked to Dan, and I think, to be fair, he gets it, but he thinks he would think that it's the combination of a lot of different systems coming together and giving you the illusion of this theater in the mind when it's,
Well, I once wrote a humorous piece for the Journal of Consciousness Studies where I suggested that the only empirical observable effect of consciousness occurs if we happen to be talking about a professional philosopher, and then that person's philosophy will reflect whether they experience it or not. Right. And other than that, there's nothing empirically relevant about it. Here's fundamentally what I think. Fundamentally what I think is that we know very little about this world we find ourselves in, and that the process of doing science is best served by humility, that we shouldn't assume that we're only a millimeter away from a theory of everything unless we have very good evidence of that. So you can't pretend that you've unified general relativity and quantum field theory until you've actually done that. And in the same way, until we can explain this subjective experience of experience thing, I think we should accept it as being there. Now, in my own work, I am perfectly willing to set it aside and to pretend it isn't there for most of the time because I don't have anything practical to do with it. But in the back of my mind, as it were, I remember that there's this thing we don't understand. And I think it's more honest simply to say, well, our understanding is incomplete. Now, of course, it's perilous to do that for two reasons. One is that there's an army of people with particular superstitions who might get comfort from that. So as soon as you say, well, I think there's something funny about consciousness and maybe we're not just all computers. As soon as you say that, then people with various superstitions or religious agendas might seize upon it. And that's an unfortunate side effect.
Yeah, but our job is to be completely honest to ourselves. Whatever is real, and if other people misappropriate, they misappropriate. But we have to. Here's my problem with consciousness that I find fascinating. Whereas with general relativity and quantum physics, in terms of the unity, there's general agreement among physicists about where we are, what we know, and what we don't know. The difference with consciousness is the difference of opinion about what we know and how much we could find out among elite people who are very smart. Some would say we've made enormous progress in neuroscience, we've explained a lot of consciousness. We maybe haven't explained the entire thing of this internal personal experience, but we've explained a lot and we're almost there and I can see ourselves getting there. Others would say that, look, there's nothing really to explain anymore other than continuing to refine our neuroscience because there's no problem to begin with. Then there's another group that'll say you can use your neuroscience from here till until the sun burns out, and you will still never explain consciousness. It's inherently either unexplainable in principle, or the human mind itself can't know enough about itself. An incredible range.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Well, a fascinating potential scenario is that collectively, universally, humanity might just stop believing in consciousness. I mean, there's no disciplinarian standing over us saying, you must notice that you have subjective awareness. Yeah. And so I think if we stop noticing it, if we stop having a vocabulary to talk about it, if we pretend it isn't there, it might as well not be there.
Well,
perhaps we can get rid of it. Perhaps we can abandon it.
I think maybe, but why should we? I mean, I think it's the most fundamental thing we can deal with. In your work that you've pioneered in virtual reality, I mean, you're dealing with consciousness. I mean, this is something that you are manipulating, and that is the essence of what you do.
Well, I think the project of virtuality is more modest than that. We can manipulate the sensorium, and we can manipulate the content of experience.
That's pretty important, because you're touching the essence of what we're talking about.
Well, there is this interesting sensation if you have a really good quality and well-designed virtual world experience, where suddenly you realize, hey, I'm floating through this thing, and I forgot that I had a physical body, and there's just this thing here in the middle of it, and what is that thing?
Right.
And that's one way to notice that there's something about consciousness, if you're looking for ways to notice that.
Well, I think that's a legitimate interest. I mean, when you're in this process, does it give you a greater confidence that there is such a thing as consciousness? Because you've lost your bodily world?
And perhaps a little bit. I can give you a variety of arguments that consciousness, in the sense I'm speaking of it, exists, but ultimately you can't prove it to someone. They either feel it or they don't, which is what's so peculiar about it. The same people who don't like consciousness tend to not like non-determinism, because if there's non-determinism, then there's some spooky thing that causes the future to be the way it is. So they tend to like determinism. But if we live in a deterministic world, if it's like a big let's say a multidimensional sculpture, a four-dimensional sculpture that we could step outside of hypothetically and see the future and the past as one fully realized whole. If that's possible, then how is it possible that we can identify what moment we're in? Like, what makes now now? And it's a very simple question, and yet it's quite a profound one. If you believe in non-determinism, you don't have to worry about it. But if you believe in determinism, the fact that now is now, even if now is very fuzzy because of neurology and relativity and all the many things that make now fuzzy, the fact that there's a now indicates there's some marker that makes this now, and that's consciousness.
This is the importance of consciousness. It affects our sense of time. It affects our sense of free will. It affects our sense of is the world determined or indeterminate. I mean, it is a concept that pervades a lot of the important aspects of existence.
One thing that I'll note empirically is that, and I hate to use this language, but people who believe in consciousness or people who acknowledge experiencing it tend to also have a package of other ideas. And I don't want to say that this is absolutely always true, but it is certainly almost always true that they tend to be, if I can say this, a little more humanistic, a little softer in their approach to things. And there's a sort of a cultural shift. And I don't know how to explain that, but it's as if there's like a trickle-down effect of your position on this particular idea. And I think that that's significant. And honestly, given a lack of fundamental evidence or argument to sway me one way or the other, that pragmatic concern might be enough to make me want to believe in consciousness if I was doubting it on any particular day. Now, of course, the real drama of the question of consciousness is this other thing, which I have absolutely no insight on, which is the possibility of an afterlife or something like that. And that's the name of the game for a lot of people who think about this, understandably. The one thing I can say about it is that I think the scientific community ought to not tread on that territory unless it has something constructive to say. I think to have scientists sort of be in the position of telling people, don't believe in that, don't have any hope, don't have any faith, is simply dumb because it's not something we really have evidence about. I think what we can say is make your faith disciplined so that you don't get manipulated by people trying to build power bases in this life or by people trying to sell silly superstitions. We can ask people to have disciplined faith, which is what I think a moderate religious belief is. But I think this sort of this kind of hard attack on soft faith will backfire and is destructive and ultimately isn't honest, because I think a lot of us do feel this consciousness thing inside, and a lot of us wonder what it's all about at some larger level. We just don't have the tools to do anything but wonder.